Have you ever wondered if the God we know from the Bible was ever known beyond the borders of Israel? What if I told you that long before Moses stood before the burning bush, before Abraham wandered the deserts of Canaan, and even before the nation of Israel existed, people were already calling on the name of Yahweh? Imagine a world just a few generations from Eden, where humanity was learning to survive, struggling to understand the mysteries of life, yet already lifting their voices toward a divine presence that would echo across millennia. In Genesis 26, it says, "At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord." That Lord is Yahweh, the eternal God, whose name signifies existence itself. Who was, who is, and who forever shall be. Can you feel the weight of that moment? Even in humanity's earliest struggles, long before laws were etched in stone or temples were raised, the worship of Yahweh had already begun. Today, we are going to uncover the astonishing truth. Yahweh's reach was not limited to Israel. His name was whispered in ancient lands, sung in quiet corners, and honored by faithful hearts far from the tents of Jacob. And as we journey together through these stories, you will see just how vast and inclusive God's plan truly is. If you are ready to explore this ancient mystery and see the Bible in a whole new light, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you do not miss a single revelation. Trust me, what you are about to discover will change the way you think about God's story forever. Stay with me, because the journey begins right now. As we continue our journey into the depths of ancient worship, pause for a moment and consider the name Yahweh. It is not merely a label or a title. It is a revelation in itself, drawn from the Hebrew verb to be, carrying the staggering weight of eternal existence. This is a God who transcends the fragile boundaries of human time, whose presence is not confined by the rise and fall of kingdoms, the passing of generations, or the limitations of mortal understanding. When Enosh and those early generations lifted their voices in prayer, they were not calling upon a distant, abstract force, but upon a presence so profound that it had been woven into the very fabric of reality, a presence that simply is, that always was, and that will forever be. The implications are breathtaking. Long before Moses would question the burning bush, long before Abraham would raise altars in foreign lands, humanity had already glimpsed a truth so vast that it defies the constraints of history. Yahweh exists beyond the contours of human perception, reaching out to those who dare to seek with hearts open and minds attentive. Imagine standing in that ancient world, dust still clinging to your feet, the sky stretching vast and unbroken above, and hearing that sacred name whispered through the rustle of leaves, the babble of rivers, and the soft murmurs of your ancestors around the fire. It is a name that carries with it both mystery and intimacy, a bridge between the infinite and the fragile, the eternal and the fleeting. To call upon Yahweh was to step into a rhythm of existence that transcended the ordinary, to recognize that life itself is held within the grasp of something enduring, unshakable, and sovereign. And yet, it is not a distant majesty that intimidates, but a presence that draws, a divine invitation reaching into the hearts of those who might otherwise feel forgotten or unseen. This eternal dimension of Yahweh is what links every story of faith across the tapestry of human history. From the earliest prayers of Enosh to Abraham's wandering footsteps across unfamiliar sands, from the mysterious priesthood of Melchizedek to Job's trembling cries in a distant land, the same eternal presence resonates, consistent and unwavering. Yahweh's name is a thread that binds generations, connecting the whispered hopes of those long gone with the faith of those yet to come, reminding us that even before nations formed, before temples rose, before written laws guided a people, there was a God whose essence was already known, whose reality was already sensed, whose invitation to trust, worship, and seek stretched far beyond what the human eye could see. In understanding Yahweh as the eternal I Am, we begin to perceive the scale and scope of this divine presence, not confined to Israel, not limited by lineage, not bound by geography or circumstance, but moving invisibly through time, touching hearts across deserts, mountains, and rivers, offering a sense of constancy and hope to those who call upon this name with sincerity. To know Yahweh is to engage with the eternal, to glimpse the infinite amidst the finite, and to recognize that every act of devotion, every quiet whisper of faith, every altar built in solitude or in community, is part of a larger story, a story that stretches backward to the very beginnings of humanity and forward to every generation that follows. In this understanding, Yahweh is more than a name. Yahweh is the pulse of existence itself, a presence that never falters, never fades, and never ceases to call, inviting all who listen to step into the vast, unending rhythm of the eternal. Long before the tents of Israel were pitched across the hills of Canaan, Abraham walked a land that was foreign yet promised, a place where the horizon stretched wide and unknown, and every step carried the weight of both uncertainty and divine expectation. He was a man uprooted from familiar soil, leaving behind the lands of his birth and the comfort of ancestors. Yet in the midst of this wandering, he carried a memory older than himself, a whisper of something eternal that had been passed down through generations. When Abraham built his altars and lifted his voice in prayer, calling upon the name of Yahweh, he was not discovering a deity for the first time. He was reaching back through the corridors of ancestral memory, connecting to the same eternal presence that had been known to Enosh, that had been quietly worshipped and revered long before nations formed and borders were drawn, long before stone tablets would carry commandments etched in law. Picture Abraham standing beneath the vast sky, the sun setting in a blaze of color over the rugged hills of Canaan, his hands raised in devotion, the wind whispering through the tents and palms around him. In that moment, the name Yahweh was more than a sound. It was a living connection, a bridge between generations who had sought the same presence, prayed the same prayers, and glimpsed the same truth across centuries. Every altar he built, every offering he laid upon it, was a testimony not only of faith but of continuity, a thread linking him to those who had called upon Yahweh before him and those who would follow, binding the scattered fragments of human longing into a story that stretches across time. As Abraham invoked Yahweh in Canaan, he was not merely practicing ritual, he was affirming a legacy, honoring a divine relationship that transcended his immediate circumstances, his personal fears, and the uncertainties of a nomadic life. Each prayer, each whispered name, carried echoes of the past while planting seeds for the future, reinforcing that Yahweh's presence was never confined to one family, one land, or one covenant, but had been stirring the hearts of the faithful wherever they might be found. In calling upon Yahweh, Abraham affirmed that the eternal God had always been near, weaving himself into the lives of humanity, revealing a continuity that defied time, geography, and the rise and fall of kingdoms, and offering a living example of devotion passed from ancestor to descendant, from one faithful heart to another, enduring through generations. Walking with Abraham in the deserts and plains of Canaan, we begin to understand that the worship of Yahweh is not a momentary spark, but a flame carried across generations, a rhythm of faith that links the earliest humans to those who would one day form nations, sacred texts, and carry forward the memory of the eternal I Am. Each step Abraham took, each altar he raised, was a declaration that the God who existed before history and would endure beyond it was already present, already shaping lives, already drawing hearts into a story far larger than any one person could comprehend. And in that story, the voice of Yahweh continues to echo, reaching across time, calling to anyone willing to hear, reminding us that worship is never confined by borders, never limited to a single lineage, and never bound by the fleeting moment, but is a living, breathing thread connecting all who seek the eternal presence, from the dawn of humanity to this very day. Long before the people of Israel had been shaped into a nation, long before priests in the tabernacle lifted incense in solemn ritual, and before kings carved the boundaries of their kingdoms, there stood a figure whose presence shimmered with mystery and authority, a man whose story has echoed through the corridors of time with profound significance. The king of Salem. Melchizedek. Imagine the scene. Abraham, weary from battle and burdened with the spoils of victory, moves through rugged valleys with his reclaimed captives and tired warriors, his thoughts heavy yet attentive to the unseen guidance that has led him this far. Then, almost without warning, Melchizedek emerges from the mists of history, not as a shadow, not as a whisper, but as a living priest of the Most High God, extending bread and wine in a gesture of blessing and recognition. In that moment, the ordinary and the divine converge, and the name Yahweh, the eternal I, flows naturally from a man who bears no connection to Abraham's lineage, no law yet written, no nation yet formed. This encounter defies expectation and stretches the imagination, for here is a priest-king serving the same God Abraham revered, standing in a land untouched by Israelite law, a living testament to the truth that worship of Yahweh was never confined by ancestry or geography. When Melchizedek blesses Abraham, saying, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth," and Abraham responds by offering a tenth of all he possesses, it is not merely a ritualistic exchange, but a profound acknowledgement that the presence of God transcends human divisions, and that the reverence for the eternal name had already taken root far beyond what we might have imagined. In Melchizedek's priesthood, there is continuity of worship, a bridge between generations and cultures, demonstrating that the sacred name of Yahweh was not limited to descendants of Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, but was alive in the hearts of those who sought and honored the divine with sincerity and devotion. Consider for a moment the implications. A king in Salem, in lands perhaps distant from the deserts and tents of Abraham, serves the same God who whispers promises to wandering nomads, who calls hearts to devotion long before covenants are etched in stone, long before a chosen people claim possession of sacred lands. This singular moment illuminates a pattern of divine engagement that defies human assumptions, revealing that God's presence has always extended beyond borders, beyond family lines, beyond the confines of what societies might consider rightful inheritance. The bread and wine Melchizedek brings are more than sustenance. They are symbols of fellowship and recognition, tangible expressions of worship that acknowledge the eternal God whose name has been carried from generation to generation, whispered under starry skies, spoken in moments of awe, and honored even in lands where no Israelite flag has ever flown. Melchizedek stands as a luminous witness that the story of Yahweh's worship is broader than any one lineage, that devotion is not bound by the rise of nations, the drawing of borders, or the codification of law, but moves in mysterious ways, reaching hearts prepared to respond. His brief but powerful appearance connects the threads we have traced from Enosh calling upon the name of Yahweh, to Abraham invoking the eternal presence in Canaan, showing us that God's reach is unconfined, that the sacred name travels invisibly across time and space, finding its way into lives and stories that human eyes might never expect. Through Melchizedek, we glimpse the astonishing truth that worship of Yahweh was never limited, never provincial, and that even before Israel existed, the eternal God was already known, honored, and revered in places hidden from history's usual maps, laying the foundation for a story that would stretch across centuries, across nations, and into the very hearts of those willing to hear and respond to the eternal call. Long before the thunder of Sinai shook the wilderness, and the tablets of law were carved by divine hand, Moses found himself tending the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro, in the sun-baked hills of Midian, a land far removed from the deserts of Egypt or the yet-to-be-established nation of Israel. Picture the scene. A young man, once a prince, now humbled to shepherd, moving among the sheep with careful attention, learning patience, perseverance, and the rhythms of life that stretch beyond human plans. And here, in this quiet and seemingly ordinary landscape, stands Jethro, not merely a family patriarch, but a priest devoted to the one true God, Yahweh, whose name had echoed from the earliest generations, long before covenants, altars, or Israelite banners came into being. In this household, Moses was introduced to the profound reality that the worship of Yahweh was not confined to one tribe, one lineage, or one chosen nation, but had already reached hearts willing to seek, honor, and recognize the eternal presence. Imagine the lessons woven into everyday life under Jethro's guidance. The prayers whispered over the flock at dawn. The recognition of God's sovereignty in the subtle patterns of the desert. The quiet wisdom imparted without fanfare or ritual, yet saturated with devotion and understanding. Jethro's faith was not dependent on tablets, formal law, or the political structures of Israel. It was a living, breathing connection to Yahweh, cultivated through observation, reflection, and reverent practice. When Moses eventually led Israel out of Egypt, through plagues, parted seas, and miraculous provision, it was under the eyes of a father-in-law whose worship had anticipated these events, whose heart was aligned with God's purposes beyond any tribal boundary, who rejoiced in Yahweh's deliverance and offered burnt offerings and sacrifices in acknowledgement of his supremacy. Pause for a moment to consider the extraordinary implications. Here is a man whose devotion existed outside the covenantal lines that would define Israel, yet his faith aligns seamlessly with God's unfolding plan. Jethro's story challenges the notion that divine influence is limited to familiar places, family lines, or established religious structures, revealing instead that Yahweh has always been at work, preparing hearts, nurturing worshippers, and extending his presence to unexpected lands and unexpected people. When he blesses Israel, dining alongside Moses and the elders, it is a moment that bridges cultures, transcends tribal affiliations, and underscores the universality of God's reach, demonstrating that the sacred name of Yahweh resonates wherever a receptive heart exists. In the quiet shadows of Midian, Jethro's worship forms an invisible link between generations, a continuity stretching from Enosh calling upon Yahweh, through Abraham invoking the eternal name in Canaan, to Melchizedek, priest king of Salem, blessing those he encounters. Each of these lives testifies that devotion to the eternal God is not constrained by lineage or geography but flows freely into any heart that dares to recognize it. Through Jethro, we see that God's influence transcends human expectations, moving in ways that quietly prepare the world for the extraordinary events yet to come, shaping hearts and lives outside the confines of Israelite borders, and revealing that the eternal presence of Yahweh has always been accessible to anyone willing to seek, honor, and respond to the call of the divine. Jethro's story reminds us that the unfolding narrative of God is never limited by walls, fences, or heritage, that Yahweh has always been reaching out to souls across deserts, mountains, and distant lands, inviting them into relationship, guiding them in worship, and preparing them to participate in a plan far greater than human imagination, ensuring that the sacred presence flows not only through the chosen nation, but into every willing heart. Long before history recorded the laws, temples, and rituals that would later define Israelite worship, far beyond the familiar hills of Canaan and the deserts where Abraham wandered, there lived a man named Job, whose story is etched not in the lineage of Israel, but in the annals of humanity reaching for understanding and connection with the divine. A man whose life reflects the astonishing truth that Yahweh's presence and guidance were never confined to one nation, one family, or one chosen line. Imagine Job's world, a land not defined by covenant or tribal identity, where the rhythms of life were shaped by sun-scorched plains, uncertain harvests, and the ever-present vulnerability of human existence. Yet here, in the midst of ordinary life and extraordinary trials, a profound, intimate relationship with the eternal God flourished. Job's faith was not inherited through ancestral memory nor dependent on formal law. It was forged in the crucible of experience, in joy and sorrow, in prosperity and loss, and in the depths of his own questioning heart, where he wrestled with the meaning of suffering, the justice of creation, and the unseen hand that governs the cosmos. As his story unfolds, we see a man whose wealth, family, and comfort were stripped away in swift succession, leaving him exposed to grief and confusion. Yet in this vulnerability, Job's voice rises to the heavens, acknowledging the sovereignty of Yahweh, proclaiming, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And in this proclamation, we hear the echo of a timeless truth, that God's reach extends far beyond the confines of Israel, touching hearts across nations, cultures, and circumstances, inviting every soul willing to listen into a sacred dialogue of trust, hope, and recognition of the divine. Job's lamentations. His questions, his wrestling with friends and with the mysteries of God's justice, are not the complaints of an outsider cut off from divine revelation, but rather the expressions of a seeker intimately acquainted with the eternal presence, demonstrating that knowledge of Yahweh had already permeated the lives of those scattered across the ancient world, long before the establishment of Israelite law or priesthood. Consider the courage it took to call upon Yahweh amidst isolation and loss, to maintain faith when there was no formal temple, no priestly guidance, no covenantal promises in writing to anchor his trust, only the raw, immediate experience of encountering the living God. Job's story, interwoven with the threads of Abraham's wandering altars, Melchizedek's priestly blessing, and Jethro's faithful service, paints a portrait of a world where God's name and presence were not restricted to borders or lineage, but were living realities in the hearts of those attuned to his call, wherever they lived, however they understood the mysteries of creation, and however far they stood from the nations that would later claim covenantal identity. Through Job, we witness the profound inclusivity of God's engagement with humanity, a recognition that faith, worship, and relationship with Yahweh are not privileges confined to a particular tribe or nation, but gifts accessible to anyone who listens, seeks, and responds, a theme that resonates with the stories of others who encountered God across unexpected landscapes, showing continuity in divine revelation that surpasses human boundaries. Job's unwavering connection to Yah, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, emphasizes that the pursuit of God's presence is universal, transcending geography, heritage, and circumstance, and serves as a luminous testament to the truth that from the earliest days of human history, Yahweh has been calling hearts scattered across the earth, weaving a tapestry of worship, devotion, and an intimate relationship that stretches far beyond Israel, revealing a God whose reach and mercy know no borders, whose name and presence have always been near to all who dare to seek him, and whose eternal essence lives in ways both profound and personal, long before the rise of nations or the establishment of sacred laws. Far from the familiar hills and valleys where the descendants of Abraham wandered, in lands whose names have long been swallowed by the sands of time, there lived a man named Balaam, a prophet whose reputation was tangled with ambition, vanity, and the allure of worldly reward. Yet despite the flaws that marred his character and the moral compromises that would later define his legacy, he stands as an extraordinary witness to a truth that stretches across generations. Yahweh's voice, his presence, and his revelation were never confined to Israel, never limited to the faithful remnant of a single tribe, but reached into distant lands, touching hearts that dared to recognize the sacred even in the midst of human weakness and imperfection. Picture Balaam, riding along roads that stretched from Petha to the plains of Moab, far from the tents of Jacob and the altars of Abraham, confronted by the divine in ways that startled, humbled, and redirected him. For the God who had spoken from the burning bush to Moses, who had walked with Job in grief and blessed Abraham through Melchizedek, now spoke to Balaam directly, compelling him to listen, to heed, and ultimately to proclaim what the world might least have expected: the sovereignty of Yahweh. In Balaam's encounter, the sacred name that had echoed from Enosh's generation, that had been invoked by wandering patriarchs and preserved by faithful priests like Jethro, now crossed the boundaries of culture, geography, and morality, demonstrating that God's revelation is not bound by human expectations or confined to the hearts of the righteous alone, but penetrates even the most unlikely vessels, turning intentions, plans, and imperfect understandings into instruments of divine purpose. As Balaam prepared to curse Israel at the behest of King Balak, he discovered a startling truth: the one whose plans he sought to manipulate had already sealed a destiny beyond his comprehension, and the words that tumbled from his lips, meant to harm, instead flowed as prophecy, declaring blessings and pointing to a future that would culminate in the coming of the Messiah, a star arising from Jacob and a scepter wielded in righteousness, a revelation that would have seemed impossible had it not been for God's intervention and Balaam's recognition, however flawed, of the sacred name Yeh. This narrative illuminates the astonishing breadth of God's engagement with humanity. He does not limit his work to the faithful or the predictable, to those who already walk in covenant or law, but reaches across foreign lands, through imperfect hearts, and even into lives shadowed by self-interest, to reveal his plans, his name, and his glory. Balaam's story intertwines seamlessly with the threads of Abraham's altars, Melchizedek's priestly blessings, Jethro's devotion, and Job's steadfast faith, forming a panorama of divine activity that transcends borders, lineage, and human expectation, highlighting a God whose voice echoes to those willing to hear, regardless of nationality, status, or moral standing. Through Balaam, we grasp that Yahweh's revelation has always been inclusive, persistent, and far-reaching, capable of penetrating distance, corruption, and the limitations of human understanding, demonstrating that the sacred name is never restricted, that divine purpose can unfold through unexpected channels, and that the reach of God's presence stretches far beyond any single covenant, nation, or tradition, inviting all who listen, even the unlikely and flawed, into the unfolding story of redemption, blessing, and worship, a story that began long before Israel's formation and continues to echo through time, touching hearts wherever they are ready to recognize the eternal, sovereign, and transcendent God whose name is Yah. As we reach the close of this remarkable journey through the ancient pages of Scripture, one truth emerges with breathtaking clarity: Yahweh's presence has never been constrained by geography, nationality, or lineage. From the earliest generations, beginning with Enosh, to the wandering patriarch Abraham invoking his name in Canaan, to Melchizedek blessing Abram outside Israel's borders, to Jethro's devotion in Midian, to Job's intimate communion with God far from the chosen nation, and even to Balaam, a foreign prophet whose flawed intentions were turned into blessings by divine will, the story of Yahweh reveals a God who reaches beyond human boundaries, calling all hearts willing to listen into relationship with him. The sacred name Yahweh, the eternal I, has always been a bridge across time, culture, and circumstance, inviting anyone and everyone to experience his presence, mercy, and guidance, showing that true worship is not limited to tribes, temples, or traditions, but is an intimate connection that transcends every human division. What does this mean for us today? It is an invitation to recognize that God's love, guidance, and revelation are not reserved for the expected or the privileged. Just as he spoke to shepherds in foreign lands, revealed truth to distant prophets, and walked with those outside the covenant, he calls each of us into the ongoing story of his kingdom, offering a relationship that is personal, transformative, and inclusive. Our backgrounds, histories, or past mistakes do not disqualify us from encountering the eternal presence of Yahweh. His story has always been bigger than any single people or place, and the threads of his revelation continue to weave through our lives, waiting for our hearts to respond, ready to plant seeds of understanding, hope, and worship in every corner of the world. As we close this exploration, take a moment to reflect on the ways in which Yahweh might already be speaking in your life, perhaps through quiet nudges, unexpected encounters, or moments of awe that remind you his reach is limitless. Let this truth inspire you to lift your own voice in recognition of the God who has been calling humanity from the beginning, to embrace the invitation to seek him, and to witness his presence in places both familiar and unexpected. If this story has touched you, opened your eyes to the vastness of God's love, or stirred curiosity about the ways he is at work across history and culture, I encourage you to join the conversation. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let us know how these ancient truths resonate with your own journey. And if you have been inspired by this exploration, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can continue uncovering the hidden treasures of Scripture. Stories that reveal how Yahweh's eternal presence has always been reaching out to hearts willing to listen. Thank you so much for spending this time together, for exploring the far-reaching story of God's love, and for allowing these ancient voices to remind us that his invitation is always open, for every generation, every nation, and every heart. May you walk forward encouraged, knowing that Yahweh's name, his presence, and his call to worship continue to echo across time and into your life today.